So I want to welcome everyone to our website, our webinar hosted by the Drug-Free America Foundation, supported by the Florida Department of Health. The program today is entitled Marijuana and Mother's Milk, What We Know, and is a part of Drug-Free America Foundation's Marijuana and Pregnancy Educational Project. My name is Ashley Reedy, and I am the program manager at Drug-Free America Foundation. And so we have a couple of housekeeping things we're going to go over. But before we do that, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, put where you're from, the organization you're from, that would be very helpful. And yeah, we'll just get into those housekeeping things that we want to go over. So first and foremost, please write any of your questions that you have in the Q&A box and try to refrain from putting those in the chat. That just makes it easier for us to make sure we see your question and we get an opportunity to answer it. And we'll leave at least like 5 or 10 minutes here at the end to be able to go over those questions and get answers to those. Next, the webinar will be recorded. So you will receive a link to it after the webinar is over, as well as the PowerPoint presentation and a certificate of attendance. And then we will also have a survey at the very end of the webinar. If you can hang on to the end and fill that out for us, that'll give us some very helpful information, and it's really short. So that kind of covers all of our housekeeping things. And so now we're going to actually go on and introduce our amazing presenter for the day. Her name is Mirine Richey. Mirine is an expert faculty in maternal and child health with the FSU Center for Prevention and Early Intervention Policy. Her work centers around the training of national home visiting programs and community health providers. Over 900 participants have completed the FSU Breastfeeding Counselor course since its launch in 2019. And prior to her work at FSU, Mirine worked in the WIC program as a lactation consultant and in the Florida home visiting programs, both as direct service staff and later as the statewide training coordinator. So welcome, Mirine, and I'm going to pass the baton off to you and let you get started with the presentation.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to you all for having me today and for covering this very important, really specific content about the work that you do. So I appreciate it. So thank you for the introduction. And yes, I train home visiting programs as well as a breastfeeding counselor course. And just glancing at the chat, which I will not be watching too much once I start talking, but I was watching everybody and I see a lot of friends, a lot of home visitors that I know joining the program today. So welcome everyone. Glad to see some familiar names. You're all valued. I really appreciate you all being here. Hopefully, if you've heard me talk before, hopefully I can hit a few different things in terms of our content today, because we're really going to just kind of drill down and look at this very specific piece of lactation. So Ashley introduced me, but just a little bit more about me. I'm an international board certified lactation consultant, or what they call IBCLC. And I've been an IBCLC since 2006. And have worked, like she said, in a few different capacities. I started out working in Healthy Start Home Visiting here in Florida. It was my very, very first public health job in Marion County, Florida, which I saw someone from Marion County on the line. And from there, I worked in Monroe County down in South Florida and partnered quite a bit with Miami-Dade County at the time in home visiting, and then went on to work for the WIC program in my community. So I've had a few different roles, and all along the way would do some PRN work at my local hospitals, both small and some of the bigger hospitals in Miami as a lactation consultant to, really broaden my horizons in my practice. And I've also done some community work as well, private practice and things like that. So a little bit of everything along the way of lactation. And now I've settled into my role at FSU, training others and trying to inspire you all so that when you talk to your clients, you've got a whole lot more that you feel empowered to say. So that's where that's where I spend the majority of my time now. If you're not familiar with our center at FSU, it's called the Center for Prevention and Early Intervention Policy. It's located up here in Tallahassee at Florida State. And we have a few different things that we do. So just a little background about us. We started as a center with the federal Healthy Start grant money back in the early 90s and formed a curriculum. That curriculum is called Partners for a Healthy Baby. If you're a home visiting program person, you may be familiar with our curriculum. It is for all home visiting models, not just one in particular model. But we do have an early Head Start program at our center that serves Gadsden County, Florida, which is rural. And then we also have a Young Parents Project home visiting, which serves Miami urban and North Florida rural. And that specifically is a home visiting project that was designed for teens who are interfacing with the juvenile justice system. So a very niche group of folks that need to be served. And then we've added our breastfeeding counselor course, which I did prior to coming to the center, but brought it to the center when I joined full-time in 2019. And then we also do infant mental health training. We have an early childhood courts program. So we like to say we do everything first 1,000 days. We do everything 0 to 3, both in maternal and child health, as well as early childhood education. So this topic fits in nicely. Our Partners for a Healthy Baby, which I will reference a couple of times because it's a great resource and I know many home visitors use it. And I know some of you are with home visiting programs, but so I will reference it as a resource. If it's something you're not familiar with, you can always check it out. But it's basically a curriculum that covers these 4 very broad categories of family development, maternal family health, preparing, caring for baby, and then development from pregnancy through age 3. And by curriculum, I mean it's got teaching information for you and your role. And then it has a handout that goes with the lesson or with the content to the parent. So we have moved to an all digital format so that it's textable and emailable as well as printable. So if you're not familiar with Partners for a Healthy Baby, I'll give it a little plug so that you can check it out. And towards the end of the program today, I'll make sure you've got my contact information and our website. We, like I said, we do serve all kinds of models and programs throughout the US. So depending on what you do in your role, I bet I've had a little bit of interfacing, at least with some of you all, whether it's faith-based, community, nonprofit, healthy families, Healthy Start, parents as teachers, early Head Start. And like I said, I came from the WIC program myself. So we serve all kinds of programs everywhere. All right, so for today, so for our limited time together, I know that these were published on the webinar, but just as a kind of reminder, this is what I'm trying to make sure that I cover to the best of my ability today, which is to kind of bring attention to some of the effects of marijuana and breastfeeding and the impact on the infant, but not just the infant. What does it do to the actual milk? So we're going to talk about the impact on the actual milk composition. And then I want to always promote any type of communication strategies or counseling strategies that might be helpful for you to add to your toolkit. So that's where we're going today. If there's something of interest that I didn't cover towards the end, we will give the time for some questions as well. And I know that if you are a regular attendee of these webinars, you've probably attended some that were geared around pregnancy. And there's a lot of information out there on pregnancy, not just from Drug Free America, but other sources as well. And a lot of it centers on those physical and emotional changes of pregnancy and when and why marijuana might be used. So I'm going to just do a brief reminder of those, but then I'm going to move in more to the lactation side of things. But some of the motivators that are known during pregnancy is that, first of all, it's a time of immense physical and emotional stress. So oftentimes women will revert to whatever coping strategies they've used in the past, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or marijuana or other drugs. So basically, we know that that carries over quite a bit. Unless we, in our role, help engage them and give them some new strategies for dealing and coping during pregnancy. And a lot of it is centered around those physical challenges. There's so many physical changes, of course, that happen during pregnancy, and a lot of them are very uncomfortable. So that can be a pretty big motivator during pregnancy. It's estimated that about 50% of non-pregnant users will continue during pregnancy. Now, pregnancy is often a motivator for behavior change. Even for those, we're not even necessarily talking about any kind of drugs or alcohol, but it's a big motivator for women to eat a little better or exercise a little bit more or manage their stress a little better. It's just a really great motivational time. And so we will see that many will abandon kind of those negative habits, such as marijuana, but not all, unfortunately. Some of it can be explained because we've seen these trends kind of contribute to legalization, as well as more cultural shifts in acceptance. We do see a lot more of destigmatizing of marijuana use, not just because of the medical, but recreational as well. I mean, it is carrying over. And then if you add those increased pregnancy physical challenges around the stress of parenting or the stress about becoming a parent, we can start to see some of the motivational factors behind marijuana use during the pregnancy. And there's also beliefs that it takes care of nausea, that may help with the backaches that come along with pregnancy, the stress, just as a de-stress motivator overall. And then also sleep becomes more challenging during pregnancy. And so there's some beliefs around marijuana for sleep as well. So if you start thinking about some of the motivations during pregnancy, also thinking about what changes are happening during the pregnancy. So besides the obvious ones of, the abdomen becoming much larger with a fetus, there's a lot already happening in the breast as well. So this is where I want to segue and start talking about what's going on in terms of milk production. So milk production actually starts early on in the pregnancy. So colostrum is that first milk. It's a milk that's made in response to pregnancy hormone. And it helps to go ahead and get made by mobilizing fats and proteins and other things in the body during the pregnancy. And this starts in the second trimester, somewhere around the 16th week. So women typically notice changes in the breast early on. Sometimes many women will tell you that's the first thing they noticed, was that there was some type of a breast change. But it's not until around that second trimester that we actually start to see the development of this early milk called colostrum. And it will be stored there basically until the birth of the baby. It's very high in a lot of properties that you don't find in more mature milk or the milk that comes after the baby is born. And it's believed that some of the components are actually forming early so that when baby is born, whether it's a 28-week baby, a 30-week preterm, or a full-term 41-weeker, what's happened is that colostrum is formed and it starts to have these characteristics of colostrum. One is called a secretory immunoglobulin A, big mouthful, but basically secretory IgA, if we want to nickname it that. And what that component does in the milk is actually it's developing during the pregnancy so that when the baby is born, when the baby gets that colostrum, that is like baby's first immunization, for lack of a better term. It contains powerful components to not only coat the baby's stomach and help keep the baby free from bacteria, but also circulates to expose the baby to protections against other infections and processes. So all of this is happening while mom is pregnant. So that's a very cool thing to remember, that actually the process of breastfeeding starts during the pregnancy. So building on that idea, what is the recommendation with breastfeeding? So if you're not up to date on this, or if this isn't your wheelhouse, here's the recommendations. And by that, I mean, this is who the American Academy of Pediatrics and the World Health Organization and the CDC and all the groups recommend. So first, we recommend start breastfeeding within that first hour after the birth. Now, we know some moms have a little more difficult birth experience or a cesarean section, et cetera. But generally speaking, we want to get that baby on breastfeeding as soon as possible. And that is because we need the baby to start receiving that colostrum. So it's very health beneficial. Then the recommendation is keep breastfeeding. It's 8 to 12 times in a 24-hour period. So 8 or more, right? We say a little rhyme, 8 or more in 24. So you're feeding baby on demand or looking for those feeding cues. So if you work in this field where you have the opportunity to help through pregnancy as well as through infant and child development, we know how to teach understanding baby's cues, kind of reading baby's language, and it starts the minute they're born with understanding what does those feeding cues or hunger cues look like. So it's recommended that you keep breastfeeding just breast milk, like they don't need cereal or applesauce or water or juice or anything like that, just only mom's milk for the first 6 months. And then somewhere around the 6-month mark, we introduce solids. So, some babies, it might be 5.5 months, some babies might be 7 months, but it's looking for those readiness signs. And we introduce the solid foods, but at the same time, we continue giving breast milk. And the recommendation is for 2 years. So some people think, oh my gosh, 2 years, that's a crazy amount of time. But keep in mind that they're not feeding 8 to 12 times in a 24-hour period. Once they start growing and eating food and going through development, but that 8 to 12 times in 24 hours, that's really during those early weeks, not for necessarily for 2 years, but continuing with milk from mom until about age 2. And some women do go longer. That's totally up to them. It's biologically normal. We may not see it as often here, especially in the United States. I know some of you signaled that you were from outside of the United States. So, it varies according to the country and culture, but biologically very normal to extend past that time. All right, so that's the recommendations. So then there are recommendations of who shouldn't be breastfeeding. And first of all, for a baby, it's really only one big condition, and that's an infant who's born with a condition called galactosemia. That's a metabolic disorder. They test for it at the time of birth. It's one of those tests that they do with the heel stick. So they look for that right away. And those babies are asked, don't get mom's milk, not even donor milk it's not the mom specifically, it's the makeup of human milk that the infant can't process. So they're put on a very specialized formula. So that's baby. Now on the mom side, there's a few conditions that is not recommended. There is a condition called HTLV or human T-cell lymphotrophic virus. It's not very common in the United States, but you will see it in other parts of the world. So that is transmitted through milk. It's not recommended that mom breastfeed if she has that. They have changed the recommendation on HIV. The HIV, if mom is HIV positive and not on antiretroviral meds, and she has a detectable load, then it's not recommended that she breastfeed. But now we've had this huge shift in drugs and drug therapies. So that has been adjusted recently. Any kind of untreated tuberculosis and really any kind of respiratory, we don't want mom face-to-face with the infant if she's got something highly contagious like that. It's not that it's in the milk, it's more of that face-to-face. And then there's some drugs that interfere, pharmaceutical drugs, radiation, nuclear medicine, things like that. They may only be temporary, but may not be safe, especially for the early part of lactation. And then illicit drug dependency is listed as well, which can be a little bit vague or subjective. And this is where we're going to kind of get into that here in just a bit. Okay, so who's breastfeeding? about 83% of our moms will start at the time of birth. Depending on where you are, it's pretty consistent across the United States. That means a lot of women are trying at first. They're getting that encouragement in the hospital. They are trying, but you can see by 6 months and then by 12 months, it's dropping off rapidly. So there's a lot of reasons behind that. But here's my question for you. What do you think the number one reason is? I'm going to launch a poll. It's anonymous, but what do you think the number one kind of reason is, the concern? You've got 4 choices there: employment, lack of support, concerns about milk making enough, or maybe concerns about pain. So I'll give you a moment to answer that. Oh, great response. Thanks, everyone. We'll give you a couple more seconds there. All right, that's a great response. Good. Perfect. All right, I'll share it with you so you can see as well. But so here's a fun fact. All of these are reasons. All of these are concerns, and all of these have research saying that these are some of the reasons why women stop breastfeeding. But the number one reason, I see you all got it right. So I think that's awesome. Concerns about making enough milk. That is the number one reason. So 43% of you did answer that one, but the rest of you weren't wrong. It's just not necessarily the number one reason when we look at the data. So thanks for checking that for me. So Florida Department of Health actually did a survey back in 2020, and they looked at those top reasons. And they also found, consistent with what the literature says, that almost 50% of women who stopped said they just didn't have enough, or they felt like their milk had dried up, or a subset felt like it just wasn't quite enough to meet the baby's demands. So I talked a little bit about the pregnancy motivators in terms of, why we might be using marijuana, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the motivators about during breastfeeding. So postpartum, we see a shift back to those who may be a little more in terms of recreational use, but there are also some beliefs about marijuana to increase milk production, or to help with postpartum depression and anxiety, or as kind of a natural pain reliever, especially when you're recovering from childbirth. So the first one there, that increasing the milk production, is interesting and often goes hand in hand with that worries about postpartum depression and anxiety, because a lot of women do feel as though breastfeeding itself can increase their anxiety, and that if they're having more anxiety, they may not produce enough milk. There are these it kind of goes into that cycle. So I want to show you, first of all, a brief, super brief, how milk is even made, because again, with concerns about milk production being number one, it's important that we who are counseling our pregnant clients understand, how's it even made? So I already mentioned that it starts during the pregnancy in response to the pregnancy hormone. But if we look inside the breast, as the pregnancy hormone stimulated the growth of the breast, it starts to stimulate the growth of what is called alveoli. And so I've got the kind of the cross section there on the slide. And in those little alveoli are the cells that make the milk. Well, how do we get the content of the milk? Well, we get that through the blood supply. So everything that goes into mom's body, good and bad, if it's absorbed and circulated in her bloodstream, it is going directly to those cells to make the milk. So milk ends up being almost closer to a blood product than more of like food. Like it mirrors our bloodstream more so than like thinking about the gastro system, right? So all the blood coming into the body, it's going all throughout the body, and it's also going into the breast to help bring those nutrients to make the milk. So that is just like the Reader's Digest version of milk production. And then the cycle goes like this. So first of all, we need the pituitary gland in the brain to release the hormones for breastfeeding. Prolactin makes the milk, oxytocin moves it down. So we've got the pituitary gland making that. And I know if you're starting to think, oh my gosh, this sounded technical, stick with me. This is going somewhere. So the pituitary is making these hormones. Those hormones are traveling through the bloodstream to help get the milk produced and made for the baby. Baby suckles, and that suckling then sends the message back to the brain, hey, there's a baby here. Let's make milk. So this is the normal cycle. A lot of women don't understand. A lot of our clients don't know the milk production cycle. They think it's just somehow magically happening, but it's a cycle that has to be nurtured along the way. And what happens when women feel as though I don't have enough, or I've got a low amount or not enough for the baby, might be true, but a lot of times it's really a little more based on the cycle. Maybe they're not making enough hormone in the brain, and there might be reasons for that, and we'll talk about that. And then if they're not making enough hormone in the brain, it's not getting sent back through the bloodstream. Maybe the infant isn't suckling well, so maybe that's on baby. There's something going on with the baby, was born very little or too early, or what have you. And that'll decrease the stimulation and not send a signal back to the brain. So we get kind of this vicious cycle. And we know for sure if it's a low milk supply, if the baby is losing weight and not gaining it back, especially at the time of birth. So, we typically say 10% of a weight loss of the baby is normal. So if they're born at 8 pounds, we do expect that they're going to go home a little more in the 7-pound range. But we don't really want it to get too far, because that's going to be dangerous for the baby. So the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that within those first 3 days, someone needs to assess the baby. We really don't want to see it get past 7% if the infant is breastfeeding. So that means that we need to make sure our clients who are breastfeeding get a timely referral before the baby is born, so that they know who to call and who to talk to in those precious first 3 days, because those first 3 days the baby is living off that colostrum, and the milk production cycle needs to get kicked into gear. So if that's not happening, we start seeing a baby lose weight. So a lot of women, not understanding the milk production cycle, look for remedies to do themselves, which we can always say that's a strength. They're trying to help themselves. We want to always encourage self-care and trying to take care and solve your problems. But unfortunately, a lot of the remedies that are out there, not necessarily helpful. So here are a few that are kind of believed to increase supply. Pumping. So some women will start pumping, trying to pump more. There are, if you're not familiar, there are what they call lactation cookies. I've seen them in Target. I've seen them in the drugstore. Basically, it looks like a really delicious cookie that claims that will increase milk supply. Lactation or milk making teas, other beverages are out there that claim to help produce milk. That means they're claiming to increase prolactin, because that is the hormone driver of milk making. So none of those are found to be evidence-based. Even as recently as just about 2 months ago, a new study came out on lactation cookies. They're just not evidence-based. So we shouldn't be promoting them. Now, if I have a mom telling me she's eating and drinking these things, they're not going to hurt her, but it's also not as likely to fix her problem, right? And then there's some that are just like straight herbal remedies. Fenugreek, blessed thistle, there's so many out there. And cannabis has made its way into one of those kind of believed herbal remedies that might increase supply. So what are the actual remedies? Well, some of it's just getting a good start. So getting a good start at birth, and that puts a lot of reliance on the nurses at the hospital or birthing center. Avoiding pacifiers, breastfeeding on demand, and those first, 8 or more times in those first 24 hours and every 24 hours in those early weeks, making sure our clients are avoiding hormonal products at first. So we don't want to get right back on birth control. We want to make sure that we're producing our hormones normally. But a lot of it just comes down to support, and pumping can be helpful, but we still want to see latch and positioning support. So the first line of remedies is not herbal, and it's definitely not cannabis. So I told you I'd mention our curriculum, and we do have handouts for parents related to this topic of struggling with supply or struggling with issues. So I'm just going to briefly show those, but these are some of the handouts that we do in English and Spanish related to getting that early help and problem solving. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the milk production cycle. So actually, studies show that marijuana and THC can actually decrease prolactin. So remember, prolactin is the hormone being made in the brain to produce milk. So what we're seeing is that THC, which loves fat, will bind to the fatty tissues in the brain and actually can decrease prolactin, the milk-making hormone. So it's not going to increase it, it's going to decrease it. And there's been a few different research studies that suggest that. What they've also found, and this is a recent study as of 2023, that showed the milk samples of women who use cannabis have increased lactose. So lactose is that main carbohydrate needed for milk for being in the milk for the baby. That's the carbohydrate. So we're seeing an increase. What does that mean? What is going to be the impact on the infant? That's not clearly understood yet, but it can throw off that lactose level. So that's something that researchers need to know more about. We also see that SIGA that I mentioned at the beginning decreases. So you'll remember that secretory IgA is the component made during pregnancy in colostrum that's baby's like first immunization. So if it's decreased, that suggests now decreased protection. And of course, we promote breastfeeding because of all the protections it offers. So we may see a decrease in that. Also, we've seen earlier weaning. So women will not breastfeed as long who tend to be marijuana users. And there may be many confounding reasons that happens. And some of it is that also it's estimated that, about half of marijuana users also use tobacco, which impacts lactation. So we may, have some muddy data there, but, either way, this is what we are learning in terms of marijuana use and lactation. Well, what about CBD products? We see those everywhere. They're in the convenience store now, a variety of things. They can be in a personal body product, cosmetics. I've seen beverages that say they contain CBD, tinctures, kind of the drops that you put under your tongue, various supplements like pills or what have you. Now the FDA says some of these may contain trace amounts of THC. So these may not be safe if you're trying to avoid THC. They're also not regulated. So they can make claims that may or may not be true. So those are, some of the products that we may see our clients want to use because they believe that they are safe or that they don't contain THC. But what we know is that CBD, it does pass through breast milk. The effects are not well understood. There's not as much research, especially when it comes to lactation. It's a whole lot more research on pregnancy and non-pregnant. It's just limited data on lactation because there's so many factors, but it's promoted. We've all probably seen it. It's promoted for pain relief and postpartum anxiety, depression, or just overall wellness. So we need to caution our parents about using even CBD products when it comes to lactation, because it will pass through breast milk. Now, if you want to know more about medications, I'm going to give you my favorite references here. So whenever we're talking about any kind of medication, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a street drug or an herbal, most of these will look at all of the different types of drugs out there. So LactMed has been around for a long time. It's got not a very user-friendly web address, so it's there. But if you also just kind of Google LactMed, it's at National Institutes of Health. It is very evidence-based, reliable, very wordy, very lengthy to read through, not for those who are afraid of scientific language. So really a lot more pharmacist friendly, in my opinion. But there's some that are a little more friendly for those of us who maybe don't know all the pharmaceutical terms. My other favorite one is Hale. That's named after Dr. Thomas Hale out of Texas Tech. It's called Hale's Meds. He also makes an app. Love the app. It does cost money. Just letting you know, if you do a lot of lactation, totally worth it. He also publishes, I don't know if you can see, publishes the medication and mother's milk every couple of years. Cannabis is listed. And then there's a new one called Lact RX. I'm loving this app. It's newer. It's from the mothertobaby.org folks. So that is an amazing reference. And then there's infantrisk.com, also a really good reference, but not exclusive to breastfeeding. So it's got a lot, with pregnancy as well. But all of these have entries related to cannabis or CBD products, the effect on the infant, the effect on the milk, possible effects on the mother, and then maybe even thinking about those alternatives. Each one has a similar recommendation, but I've kind of just summarized them here for you. That basically all of them say it should be avoided because some of them do cite infant development or neurodevelopment. LactMed lists quite a few case studies that really get into like the specifics of one particular case. So if you're interested in that, LactMed does list quite a few case studies, and it's been updated as of April 2023. The medication and mother's milk is, I'm using the 2023 edition. It goes into more detail on how it can reduce those prolactin levels. And what's interesting about this book, and I've listed the other ones there as well, all very, very similar in terms of counseling on reducing or eliminating. What was interesting to me over the years, I've used this medication and mother's milk book for a long time. What's interesting to me is that it used to be listed as what they called L5. So L5 is like the most dangerous kind of drug, L meaning lactation. So it used to be an L5 for many years. Then I noticed in the most recent couple of editions, it went to an L4. And now in 2023, it lists both L4, which means potentially hazardous, right? It's either evidence of risk to the baby or risk to the milk production itself. But now it lists L3 if the mom is an occasional user. Now they don't really define that in that literature between chronic and occasional. So a little subjective there in terms of that, but listing L3, if it's occasional, and I do think they do have some definitions in terms of how many times per week, that it's probably compatible. Now that means because there's no controlled studies or that the risks might be minimal. So unfortunately, again, because there's not any large number of studies on this, everything that's cited is kind of case studies, meaning this mom, this one mom, or these two moms, or these three moms. So all very small numbers, but it is kind of all that we have to go on. So basically, so that you could see, even in one reference, there's a little bit of variation in the kind of caution about it. So if it can be confusing a little bit for us, we can imagine how it is for our clients. So in our curriculum, and I imagine a lot of your curriculum, we want to recommend against it, abstaining or drastically reducing. And in general, it's because medications have some cautions that we look at generally. And this is with lactation. If it's not absorbed through the GI tract, it's probably safe. I mean, maybe like a topical or something like that. Also, we want drugs that make really large proteins because they don't pass through the milk as easily. They don't pass through the bloodstream into those little milk cells as easily if it becomes like a big giant protein. But this goes for herbal preparations. And also, we don't want drugs that last a long time in the body, because if they last a long time, there's more opportunity for them to get passed on to the infant. Remember, the infant's nursing 8 or more times in a 24-hour period. So if you've got that drug in your system for a long time, it has more opportunity to accumulate and pass through. So now, how does cannabis measure up? Well, it may not be absorbed through the GI tract if it's like a topical, But if we're thinking about the inhaled, edible, or drops, we've found that those products, even if they're, eaten, smoked, the similar levels, smoking and edibles, they had similar levels in the milk, according to LACMED. And then the topical, it may not be absorbed into the bloodstream. However, we really need to use caution if we're putting these types of creams on and holding a baby, because now we might transfer, and get it on the baby's skin. So we don't want to put these kinds of things on our breasts or nipple, or anywhere that can have contact with the baby. THC does have a very large protein binding. So that is where a lot of the kind of skepticism or what have you comes through. It makes for a really large molecule. It doesn't pass through easily. But again, it can accumulate over time in fatty tissue, and it gives more opportunity. So even though at first glance, it might look like, oh, it makes a big protein, it doesn't pass through easily. But some of the other characteristics make it of caution. And then, any type of, whether it's topical or inhaled or edible or what have you, can have other contaminants. And I know you all have had webinars on how it's not always a pure product. And a lot of the studies that are out there, we're using controlled preparations, like from a dispensary. And that's really not real world for most of our clients. All right. So cannabis also lasts a really long time, 1 to 2 days in the system. Metabolites can linger for days. And like I said, it loves highly vascular fatty areas of the brain and the body. So it can be stored, and it likes the vascularity of the breast as well. All right. So I'm trying to keep an eye on my time here because I do want to give you all time to ask questions. But just kind of looking at those recommendations, again, they vary. It depends on the source. There's one study that suggests just to tell your breastfeeding clients to wait an hour after inhaling, because inhaling rapidly gets into the bloodstream so quickly. But a lot of the recommendations that are out there are based on a lack of information, not an abundance. So we always want to communicate that to our clients, that there might be some things we can do for risk reduction, but there's just a huge gap in the data. Now, this is a little more recent that was very specific to preterm infants. And what they did find is that mothers who used marijuana products with a preterm infant, which I know you all have talked probably about that in the past, that may have contributed, any kind of smoking can contribute to the baby coming early. But what they did find is that babies who got milk with THC and babies who were compared to non or formula all ended up relatively the same at discharge, which is a good sign. So some NICUs had policies of screening the milk, and some may still have that, but the evidence doesn't support withholding that milk from the baby. And that's from just from 2021, that study that was published. So preterm infants have extra special needs. The breast milk is specially suited for them. So what it's looking like is that the benefit of the breast milk is going to outweigh potential risk. So of course, that's going to be an individual decision between the doctors and the providers and the patient, but just so that you're aware of what the most recent literature has said. So it is our job to translate these recommendations, and we should say, reduce, abstain, all times, especially during lactation. But we can discuss those risk reduction strategies such as timing, but again, not a lot of evidence on that, and not enough data to tell women that they can't breastfeed either. So even with the preterm babies, but still so much is not known. So we just have to really sharpen up our counseling skills and think about, reassuring her that your role is to help, not judge, understanding all of the different variables that go on in terms of the culture shift that we are seeing. And think about kind of reverting back to your motivational interviewing strategies or your 3-step counseling of asking open-ended questions, affirming, and then educating with those targeted messages. Affirming statements being, not jumping straight to you're wrong, but jumping straight to, yeah, I've heard other clients say the same thing. You're trying to be proactive with your health. I appreciate that you're concerned. But it sounds like you're saying you're worried about milk production. Let me tell you what I know about milk production. So trying to drill down into those motivators so that we can, target that education and know your topic. Know that the data is kind of all over the place out there and that it's mixed and it's not always conclusive. But erring on the side of caution is what most of us educate our clients on. And be aware of whatever local resources that you can share with them. Acknowledge that you're concerned for the infant, that you're concerned about the baby, that you understand the challenges of breastfeeding, and that we always want to cheer moms on who are breastfeeding because that's hard enough. But, start talking about other programs that might support her on her journey to reduce or abstain. A home visiting program, or maybe you have new parent support groups in your area or breastfeeding support groups. All of these might empower her breastfeeding more and reduce that risk of early weaning, which again, we do see more so in marijuana users compared to non. In our curriculum, we do have targeted handouts on breastfeeding and alcohol and drug use. So if you are using our curriculum, make sure to check those if you're having these conversations, and know what your summary of recommendations are. Everybody says we want to avoid or at least significantly reduce, but there's a lack of data and that it's discouraged because of this lack of data, specifically with lactation. So with that, I think I'm leaving just enough time if we do have some questions, but I did want to wish you all an early happy World Breastfeeding Week. World Breastfeeding Week actually starts next week, August 1st. That week is celebrated throughout the world in terms of finding some specific ways to celebrate and encourage breastfeeding in your community. Then the entire month is dedicated to breastfeeding in the United States, National Breastfeeding Month. So I encourage you to do something in your program to highlight the importance of breastfeeding. And then if you're interested in any of, we do have a free webinar coming up in August on the code of marketing of breast milk substitutes and the recommendations for programs, as well as we have our ongoing breastfeeding counselor course. You can find us on our website. And then we're also on social media, and then my email address is there. I welcome your questions, and I know I probably won't get to all of them today, but you're welcome to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Mirine, for that amazing presentation and just providing your, expertise on marijuana and, breastfeeding mothers. And so just being able to communicate this information in a non-judgmental way is very important to helping mothers, be able to do what's best for their own health as well as their babies. And so, as you said, you've done a great job with time. So we definitely have time here to get into the Q&A box. And it looks like we do have a couple of questions. So I'll just read those off to you, Mirine, and then we can go from there.
Sure.
Okay, so it looks like one of the questions is there data on how breastfeeding and using marijuana affects the child long-term or even short-term?
So the short term, from the studies that are out there, it doesn't look like there's a lot of short term on the infant. It may be more so on the mom side. Like I said, it can reduce the prolactin level, things like that. That one study that talked about reducing that one component, that secretory IgA, and then that increase in lactose, they know that's happening. They don't know what the short or long-term impact is on the infant. So that remains an area for future research. Long-term, many studies have suggested some infant developmental interruption, some neurodevelopmental interruption. So most do look at some of those long-term. They seem like they have a little bit of trouble kind of pulling apart the data and separating it and isolating it. Because like I said, there's a lot of those, what we call confounding, where mom might also be cigarette smoking. She might also have some other issues. So it's hard to tease those out, but it remains too big of a question mark to say it's okay. So thank you for that question.
Okay. And so our next question is there a referral process for DCF with FSU's program? It would be great for some of our families.
So we have two programs. We have our Early Head Start. So you can refer to Early Head Start, and our Early Head Start serves the Gadsden County community. So usually most referrals go through a coordinated intake now. They call the Connect system throughout Florida. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. You refer the client to Connect, and then they get them into the appropriate home visiting program, which might end up being one of ours, and the same in Miami. So I'm not sure if Connect refers to the Young Parents Project, because like I said, that's a DJJ program. But if you are interested, you can go onto our website and there is information on how to refer your clients to the Young Parents Project.
Okay. I think we might have two more questions, it looks like. Is there any info on THC in milk and SIDS?
I've not seen any research specifically to THC in SIDS. However, there is a link between secondhand smoke, and that can include marijuana smoke in addition to tobacco smoke with SIDS. But again, because of the exposures, THC does end up in the infant brain, because again, THC does concentrate. It is passed through the milk when the baby drinks, and they are absorbing everything. THC does like the fatty brain tissue. So it is going to end up in the fetal brain. We know that babies poop it out. It can be detected in infant stools. So it is getting in their body. They do get rid of some of it through stools, through dirty diapers. But the long-term, I've not seen a long-term connection to the actual milk and SIDS.
Okay. Another question says, not related to marijuana use, but what can you tell a breastfeeding mom who is worried that she is not making enough and the pediatrician wants her to supplement with formula because baby has lost weight from birth?
Yeah, and this happens, and it's so unfortunate. I would tell her to see a lactation consultant, and there's often lactation consultants at their local hospital. Most WIC programs have peer counselors and lactation consultants. So make sure she gets assessed right away, because it's a lot of times that early on, it's a latching issue, which means baby needs help in learning how to do it properly. It's most likely not a milk production issue unless she's got some kind of a medical issue happening. So send her to a lactation consultant if you can in your area.
Awesome. Thank you, Mirine, for answering those questions. And if there's anybody else, there's still a couple minutes left if you want to put your questions in there. But I think I have a actually, there is a question now. So can marijuana alter sleep cycles in the baby?
That is a great question, and it seems like it would, but I don't know any data that supports that. So it may not be known right now. But everybody definitely wants their baby to sleep. That's for sure. Now, what does lactose and SIGA, do those have any impact on sleep behavior? Unknown. So yeah, that might be a future area that needs to be researched more.
Yes, definitely. Oh, looks like another question. Do you have any recommendations on tobacco use / vaping while breastfeeding?
Yeah, and of course, we always want to recommend that they reduce or eliminate as much as possible. Tobacco, thankfully, if there is a benefit, is that it doesn't last very long in the milk. It burns out very, very quickly. So it's not contraindicated. Mom can use tobacco products while breastfeeding. Of course, we always want to encourage that to happen outside of the baby's environment, like that, going back to those risk reduction strategies.
Okay. Let's see. Make sure. Looks like that was, okay, potentially a question. Research on deep sleep deprivation with marijuana use from University of Washington.
Not familiar with that one, but I will jot that one down for myself too.
Okay. And then I was just gonna close us out. I saw that one of your slides said that studies like suggest that, you know, marijuana can actually decrease the prolactin levels versus increase it. And so I think that is definitely a message that we need to, you know, amplify, especially for those mothers who are believing that it will increase their milk production. So I don't know, does your organization in any capacity have like a one-pager on that, or any information that could be public facing for that? Because I'm sure we could create something, but I didn't want to do it if you guys have already done something.
No, I mean, we do have several of our handouts do cover drug use in general and do mention marijuana, but not specifically going into that much detail. So no, we don't have that. But I'm happy to share those studies with you so that maybe you all can help come up with a one pager on that.
Yeah, so we can definitely look into that. That would be great. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. And so looks like we're coming up at the end of our webinar. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you would like information just related to our marijuana and pregnancy educational project, the follow-up email will contain all of that information for you and take you to our dedicated webpage, which we do have some one-pagers and different things about marijuana and pregnancy in general. And yeah, like I said, we'll also have a survey that pops up here at the end. If you could just take a couple seconds to fill that out for us. But once again, thank you everyone. And thank you, Mirine, for the amazing presentation and answering all of our questions.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
All right, bye-bye. This concludes the webinar.